Back in the living room, I set the tray down with a slightly unsteady hand, hoping no one noticed the lingering flush on my cheeks. My son, oblivious as ever, was already deep into a story with his other friend, Ben, laughing loudly over some shared college memory. Aaron, however, remained beside me, his presence both magnetic and unsettling. He seemed relaxed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, studying me in a way that was anything but casual. I busied myself with the snacks, trying to focus on anything other than the awareness prickling my skin. Yet, every time I glanced his way, he was already looking at me, a quiet intensity in his eyes that made me feel exposed, vulnerable in ways I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't help but wonder if he sensed it, this quiet ache I'd carried for so long, hidden beneath the layers of my marriage and the routines of family life. It was almost as if he saw straight through the polite smile I wore, as though he knew the secrets I hadn't even admitted to myself. "So, what do you do to pass the time around here, Mrs. Clark?" he asked, his voice low, just enough to keep the conversation between us. "Oh, you know the usual," I replied, trying to keep things light. "I stay busy around the house, cook, read a bit. It's not exactly thrilling, but it's nice." His gaze lingered on me, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Seems like there's more to you than that." I glanced away, feeling the warmth of his gaze and the gentle press of his words, each one weighted with meaning. "Sometimes simple is best," I murmured, hoping he'd let it go. But he only smiled, leaning in just slightly, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I don't buy it. You don't strike me as the simple type." I laughed, a nervous sound that felt foreign on my lips. "You're awfully observant, aren't you?" He shrugged, his smile widening. "Just good at reading people, I guess." A moment of silence stretched between us, charged and heavy. I glanced toward my son, but he and Ben were thoroughly engrossed in a discussion about a recent game, paying no attention to the subtle undercurrents flowing between Aaron and me. "Besides," he added, his voice softer now, "I think a woman like you deserves a little excitement, maybe something out of the ordinary." I felt my pulse quicken, a rush of warmth spreading through me, as I struggled to maintain my composure. It was a harmless comment, I told myself, just a bit of friendly banter. But there was something deeper beneath his words, a barely concealed invitation that made my heart beat faster. "You're awfully bold, aren't you?" I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. His eyes sparkled with mischief. "Only with the right company." The intensity of his gaze felt like a challenge, daring me to respond, to step out of the safe confines I'd built around myself. But just as I opened my mouth to say something, my son looked up, flashing me a warm, oblivious smile. "Hey, Mom," he called out, "Aaron was just telling us about his trip to Italy last summer. You should hear some of the stories. This guy's practically a world traveler." I tore my gaze from Aaron, grateful for the interruption, and forced a smile. "Oh, I'd love to hear about it." Aaron leaned back, looking perfectly at ease, as he launched into a story about a wild night in Rome, weaving in details that painted him as adventurous, spontaneous, a stark contrast to the quiet stability of my own life. As he spoke, I found myself captivated, not just by his words but by the way he carried himself, the ease with which he held everyone's attention. It reminded me of a younger version of myself, a version I'd buried under years of marriage and motherhood. Listening to him, I felt an unfamiliar yearning stir within me, a longing for something I couldn't quite define, something that felt dangerously close to desire. He glanced my way mid-story, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips, as if he could read the thoughts flitting through my mind. I looked away quickly, embarrassed at the thought that he might sense the effect he was having on me. But the feeling only grew stronger, building quietly beneath the surface, a gentle ache that I couldn't shake. As the evening wore on, the group's laughter filled the room, but I felt strangely detached, caught between the present and a series of unspoken thoughts. My gaze drifted to Aaron now and then, each glance only serving to heighten the tension between us. I told myself it was just harmless intrigue, the kind of innocent fascination one feels when meeting someone new and interesting. But deep down, I knew there was more to it, a spark I hadn't felt in years, a quiet thrill that lingered long after he looked away. Just then, Aaron caught my gaze, his expression softening, his eyes filled with a kind of unspoken understanding that made my heart race. In that moment, it felt as if he could see right through me, past the polite smile and the carefully curated life I'd built, straight into the heart of my loneliness and longing. "Excuse me for a second," I said, standing up, hoping the brief break would help calm the storm of emotions swirling within me. I slipped out of the room, heading toward the kitchen, but I could feel his gaze following me, a subtle heat trailing behind me that left me feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. In the quiet of the kitchen, I took a deep breath, willing myself to let go of the ridiculous thoughts swirling in my mind. He was just my son's friend, a young man full of life and charm, and I was simply flattered by the attention. There was nothing more to it, nothing real. But even as I told myself this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted, a crack forming in the carefully constructed wall around my heart, and though I tried to dismiss it, to push the thoughts away, I knew that this quiet, lingering spark was something I couldn't ignore. When I returned to the living room, I caught Aaron's eye once I saw. He smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that seemed to hold a promise of something unspoken. And as I sat back down, a soft thrill washed over me, an echo of emotions I hadn't felt in years. Perhaps I was only imagining it, projecting my own restlessness onto a young man who'd merely offered a few kind words. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something more, a subtle, unspoken connection that I couldn't deny. Either way, I felt the edges of my world shift, and for the first time in years, I found myself wondering what lay beyond the confines of my comfortable, predictable life. The next morning, I went about my day as usual, trying to shake off the strange thrill that lingered from the night before. My son's friends had stayed over, and I busied myself with tidying up the living room and preparing breakfast, hoping that a bit of routine would return everything to normal. But the memory of Aaron's intense gaze, the warmth in his voice, lingered like a forbidden melody, playing over and over in my mind. I reminded myself it was ridiculous. He was young, probably just being friendly and a bit playful. Yet, even as I told myself this, I felt the flutter of anticipation rise within me when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. I turned to see Aaron in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, his casual confidence a sharp contrast to the quiet of the morning. His hair was slightly tousled, his shirt wrinkled from sleep, and there was something inexplicably charming in the way he looked, like he belonged in my kitchen, part of my world in a way that defied explanation. "Good morning, Mrs. Clark," he said, his voice low and warm. He was using my formal name again, and the way he said it felt like he was toying with something private, a small reminder of the tension that had crackled between us the night before. "Morning, Aaron," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "Breakfast is almost ready, just waiting on the coffee." He nodded, moving further into the kitchen, his gaze holding mine with a quiet intensity that made my breath hitch. "You didn't have to go through all this trouble?" he said, glancing over the spread of food I'd laid out. I shrugged, keeping my hands busy with the coffee pot to avoid meeting his gaze for too long. "It's no trouble. I'm used to it." There was a pause, a weighted silence that seemed to settle over the room. I could feel him watching me, his presence filling the space, making it hard to ignore the warmth rising in my chest. "It must be nice to have company," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "I imagine it's quiet around here when it's just you." I glanced at him, surprised by the observation. There was something in his tone and understanding that felt deeper than idle conversation. I felt my defenses waver, a strange vulnerability washing over me as I nodded, unable to find the right words. "It's nice to have a full house every now and then," I said finally, hoping to keep the conversation light. But he didn't look away, his gaze steady, probing. "I think you deserve more than just every now and then, Mrs. Clark." My heart skipped, a rush of heat flooding my cheeks. It was a simple comment, innocent enough on the surface, but the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on me, made it feel loaded with meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, to deflect, but before I could speak, he moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Bend over fast before he gets here, he murmured, his tone a playful tease but with an undercurrent that sent a thrill through me. For a split second, I froze, caught off guard by the boldness of his words. There was a flirtatious sparkle in his eyes, a silent challenge daring me to react. It was a moment suspended in time, filled with a tension I hadn't felt in years. My rational mind told me to laugh it off, to brush it aside, but a deeper part of me, the part that craved attention, excitement, felt tempted to lean into the moment, to see where it would lead. Instead, I let out a shaky laugh, trying to keep my tone light. "You're quite the charmer, aren't you?" He smirked, leaning back slightly, but his gaze remained intense, unwavering, only with the right people. There it was again, that boldness, the quiet confidence that made it hard to look away. I felt a strange thrill, a spark that I hadn't felt in years, and though I knew it was wrong, I couldn't bring myself to ignore it. "Aaron, I think you'd better behave yourself," I said, my tone playful but carrying a hint of seriousness. He raised his hands in mock surrender, but his smirk told me he wasn't entirely backing down. "Just trying to make the morning a little more interesting, Mrs. Clark." My son walked in at that moment, yawning and oblivious to the charged moment he had interrupted. I busied myself with pouring the coffee, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling within me. But even as I handed out mugs and plates, I felt the weight of Aaron's gaze on me, a subtle reminder of the tension that now hung between us, hidden beneath the surface. As we sat down to breakfast, the conversation flowed easily between my son and his friends, laughter filling the room, and yet I felt detached, my mind still reeling from Aaron's words. Every now and then, I'd catch him glancing my way, his eyes holding a mischievous glint that sent a shiver down my spine. He was careful, subtle, but the unspoken understanding between us was clear. He was testing the boundaries, daring me to respond, to step over the line. And as much as I wanted to brush it off, to pretend it was just a harmless flirtation, I felt something awaken within me, a quiet thrill, a desire that I hadn't acknowledged in years. It was terrifying and exhilarating, a reminder of a part of myself I had buried beneath layers of routine and responsibility. When breakfast was over, my son and his friend Ben left to grab something from the car, leaving me alone with Aaron once again. The silence felt heavy, charged, and I was keenly aware of every movement, every glance. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I gathered the plates, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I'm surprised someone like you is here alone so often." I looked up, caught off guard by his words. "Someone like me?" He nodded, his eyes softening, a hint of something sincere flickering behind the playful facade. "Someone who seems too interesting to be left alone." I felt a strange warmth settle over me, his words cutting through the layers of defense I'd built around myself. It was just a compliment, I told myself, just a bit of harmless flattery. But there was something in his gaze, a quiet sincerity that made me wonder if he saw more than I wanted to show. "Well, you're flattering me," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, to brush it off as nothing. But the way he looked at me, the quiet intensity in his eyes, made it hard to ignore the flutter of excitement building in my chest. "Maybe," he said softly, his voice a gentle murmur, "or maybe I just think you deserve more." The words hung in the air, their weight settling over me like a whisper of possibility. I felt my heart race, a thrill of something unknown sparking within me, a quiet voice urging me to step closer, to lean into the warmth of his presence. But before I could respond, my son and Ben re-entered, breaking the spell, and I quickly busied myself with the dishes, hoping they wouldn't notice the flush on my cheeks. As the morning wore on, the sense of intrigue, of unspoken temptation, lingered in the air. Each glance, each subtle smile between Aaron and me felt like a silent confession, a shared secret that was both exhilarating and dangerous. And though I knew I should let it go, should push away the whispers of desire growing within me, I found myself drawn to it, unable to resist the thrill of feeling alive in a way I hadn't in years. The day passed in a slow blur, and I couldn't help but replay the morning's exchanges with Aaron in my mind, analyzing every word, every glance. The boldness of his words, the way he looked at me, left me flustered and restless in a way I hadn't been in years. It was a feeling I couldn't fully explain, a mixture of exhilaration and guilt that tugged at me from both directions. By the afternoon, my son and Ben decided to go out for a while, leaving me alone in the house with Aaron. I could feel the tension building, thickening the air between us, an invisible pull that neither of us acknowledged but both felt acutely. It was as if every quiet moment, every sidelong glance was laden with unspoken words, urging us toward something we knew was forbidden. I tried to keep busy, my hands occupied with folding laundry and tidying up, anything to distract myself from the electric undercurrent between us. But it was no use. Aaron's presence loomed large, filling the quiet spaces with an intensity that made it impossible to ignore. As I moved through the house, he followed, lingering in the doorway of each room I entered, watching me with a quiet intensity that made my heart race. At one point, I caught his reflection in the mirror, as I adjusted a picture frame on the wall, and our eyes met, his gaze soft but unreadable. I looked away quickly, feeling the flush rise to my cheeks, the weight of his attention making my skin tingle. In the kitchen, I was rinsing dishes, the steady flow of water a soothing backdrop to my turbulent thoughts. I heard his footsteps behind me, felt the warmth of his presence as he came closer, standing just close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. "No, I think I got it," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. But he didn't move away. Instead, he reached past me, his arm brushing against mine as he grabbed a towel to dry the dishes. His touch was light, almost incidental, but it sent a jolt through me, making me feel hyper-aware of every inch between us. I swallowed hard, focusing on the dishes, trying to ignore the warmth pooling in my stomach. But his presence was impossible to ignore. The quiet weight of his gaze, a constant reminder of the unspoken tension building between us. You don't have to be so formal around me," he said after a moment, his voice soft but carrying an edge that hinted at something deeper. "You can call me Aaron." I glanced at him, feeling a flicker of amusement despite myself. "And you don't have to call me Mrs. Clark," I replied, feeling a bit bolder than usual. "You can call me Lisa." His smile was slow, a quiet acknowledgement of the subtle shift between us. "All right, Lisa," he murmured, his voice wrapping around my name in a way that felt intimate, almost like a caress. The silence stretched, charged and heavy, as we stood side by side in the small kitchen. I could feel the quickening beat of my heart, the pulse thrumming in my veins, and I knew I should step away, put some distance between us. But instead, I stayed rooted in place, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence, unable to resist the quiet thrill that tingled beneath my skin. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice a gentle murmur that felt like a whisper meant only for me. It's been a long time since I met someone who caught my attention like this." The words were simple, but the weight behind them left me breathless. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made my heart stutter. I could see the sincerity there, the unspoken desire that simmered beneath the surface, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of liberation, a permission to feel, to want, even if just for a fleeting moment. I started, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in the storm of emotions swirling within me. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. His hand brushed against mine, a feather-light touch that felt both innocent and dangerously intimate. My heart raced, and I knew I should pull away, remind him and myself that this was a line we couldn't cross. But instead, I stayed, letting the tension build, allowing myself to feel the thrill of this forbidden connection. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I thought you should know." The vulnerability in his tone, the quiet sincerity, made my heart ache. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to give in to the pull, to surrender to the intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his touch. But reality quickly pulled me back, the weight of my responsibilities, my marriage, reminding me of the consequences that would follow. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to step back, putting a few inches of space between us. Aaron, we can't. He nodded, his expression softening, a hint of regret flickering in his eyes. I know. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. But even as he said the words, I could see the reluctance in his gaze, the unspoken desire that lingered between us like a promise left unfulfilled. It's just I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. It's complicated. He gave a small nod, his eyes understanding yet filled with an unspoken intensity that left me feeling breathless. Sometimes the things that are worth the most are the hardest to have. The simplicity of his words cut through me, a truth I hadn't been willing to face. I wanted to brush it off, to pretend it was just a moment of flirtation, but deep down, I knew there was something more, a connection that ran deeper than I was willing to admit. He stepped back, giving me space, but his gaze remained steady, unwavering. I respect your boundaries, Lisa, he said, his voice gentle, his tone sincere. But just know I don't think you're as alone as you feel. The words lingered, filling the silence that followed with a quiet intensity that left me feeling raw, exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. He was right, and in a way that I couldn't explain. I felt a strange sense of comfort in his words, a validation of the quiet ache I'd carried along for so long. We stood there, the silence stretching between us, filled with the weight of all that was left unspoken. And though I knew it was wrong, a part of me couldn't help but wonder what might happen if I let myself feel, if I allowed myself to lean into the thrill that Aaron's presence had awakened. Just then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment, pulling me back to reality. My son and Ben were back, their voices filling the quiet space, grounding me in the present. I quickly busied myself with putting away the dishes, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to process the depth of emotions that had surfaced. As Aaron walked away, I felt a pang of something close to regret, a quiet longing that I knew I couldn't afford to entertain. But even as I told myself to let it go, to push away the feelings he'd stirred within me, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The tension between us had reached a breaking point, and though we'd managed to hold back, I wasn't sure how much longer I could resist the pull. As the evening wore on, I found myself lost in thought, replaying the earlier moments in the kitchen with Aaron, the closeness, the soft words he'd spoken. My mind felt like a maze of emotions, each path twisting and turning, leading me deeper into a feeling I couldn't explain, one that defied the stability I'd spent years building. I'd always believed in being practical, responsible, but Aaron's presence had stirred something raw, something that made the walls around me feel less secure. I knew I was being reckless. He was my son's friend, young and vibrant, and his life was just beginning. I, on the other hand, was a married woman, with commitments and responsibilities that had shaped every part of who I was. I told myself it was nothing more than a passing fascination, a fleeting thrill born of loneliness. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the warmth of his touch, the look in his eyes that made me feel both exposed and alive. The weight of my thoughts pressed down on me as I prepared dinner, my hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of chopping vegetables and stirring pots. The quiet of the kitchen felt stifling, and I struggled to push away the conflicting emotions stirring within me. But even as I reminded myself of the reasons I couldn't cross this line, a part of me kept wondering, what would it feel like to let go? Just once. As I set the table, I heard footsteps behind me, the soft creak of the floorboard that I'd learned to recognize. I turned, half expecting to see my son, but it was Aaron, standing there with a look that was both cautious and intent, his eyes searching mine as if looking for an answer I wasn't sure I could give. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice quiet, his tone careful. I hesitated, feeling the familiar rush of warmth that his presence seemed to bring. "No, I think I've got it under control," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but I knew he could see the tension in my gaze, the way my hands trembled slightly as I arranged the dishes. He stepped closer, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You look like you have a lot on your mind." His words struck a chord, the honesty in his tone piercing through the walls I'd put up. I opened my mouth to respond, to brush it off as nothing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself caught in his gaze, unable to look away, the silence between us thick and heavy with everything we hadn't said. "Maybe I do," I murmured finally, the words barely more than a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening, a hint of empathy in his gaze that made my heart ache. "I get it. Sometimes life, it feels heavier than it should." I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words, the quiet understanding that seemed to reach deeper than I wanted to admit. He had seen through me, glimpsed the cracks in my carefully constructed life. And instead of judging, he simply offered a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that felt both comforting and dangerous. Just as I felt myself slipping further into the moment, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and I pulled back, startled. My son entered the room, his face lighting up with a casual smile as he took in the scene, oblivious to the charged atmosphere lingering between Aaron and me. "Dinner smells amazing, Mom," he said, taking his seat at the table, completely unaware of the turmoil boiling beneath the surface. I forced a smile, moving to serve the food, hoping that the simple act of eating together would bring a sense of normalcy. But even as we sat down, I could feel Aaron's gaze on me, a quiet intensity that lingered, making my skin prickle with awareness. I focused on the conversation, trying to distract myself, but every time I glanced his way, I saw the unspoken promise in his eyes, a gentle reminder of the line we'd almost crossed. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, the normal rhythms of family dinner a stark contrast to the storm swirling within me. When the meal was over, I busied myself with clearing the table, feeling an overwhelming need to escape, to find a quiet space where I could gather my thoughts. Aaron stayed behind to help with the dishes, his presence a constant reminder of the fragile line we'd been toeing. I could feel the tension between us, the quiet intensity that had only grown with each shared glance, each unspoken word. And though I knew I should tell him to leave, to give myself space to regain control, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. As I loaded the last of the dishes into the sink, Aaron moved closer, his gaze lingering on me in a way that made my pulse quicken. I felt trapped between the magnetic pull of his presence and the weight of my own fears, my own guilt, each emotion battling for dominance within me. "Lisa," he murmured, his voice soft, filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "I don't want to make things complicated, but I can't ignore this, whatever it is between us." The honesty in his tone, the quiet longing in his eyes, made it impossible to deny the pull between us. I opened my mouth to respond, to find some way to dismiss his words, but the truth was already laid bare, too clear to ignore. "Aaron, I started, my voice trailing off as I searched for the right words. But before I could say more, I heard footsteps approaching, and I turned just in time to see my son standing in the doorway, his expression casual, blissfully unaware of the charged moment he had walked in on. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone light. "Thanks for dinner. I think we're going to watch a movie now." I nodded, forcing a smile, relief and regret flooding through me in equal measure. "Of course, honey. Enjoy your movie." He smiled and left the room, leaving me alone with Aaron once more, the tension between us thickening with every second. I could see the flicker of frustration in his gaze, the unspoken words lingering between us, waiting to be acknowledged. "You should go join them," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me, a mix of longing and resignation in his eyes. "Yeah, I guess I should." He left the kitchen, leaving me standing alone, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I leaned against the counter, my heart pounding, my mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't begin to sort out. In that moment, I realized just how close I'd come to crossing a line I couldn't take back. The attraction, the thrill of his attention, had almost driven me to act on feelings I hadn't even known I was capable of. And though I'd managed to hold back the temptation, the pull between us was undeniable, a quiet, insistent voice urging me to step outside the boundaries I'd set for myself. But as I stood there, alone in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of my choices settled over me, a reminder of all I stood to lose. This flirtation, this connection, was a beautiful, dangerous thing, one that could unravel everything I'd worked so hard to build. And yet, Even as I told myself to let it go, to forget the longing in Aaron's gaze, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. He had stirred something within me, a desire that refused to be silenced, a quiet ache that lingered long after he'd walked away. The line had been drawn, but I couldn't ignore the part of me that yearned to step over it, to feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. And as the evening stretched on, the silence of the house pressing in around me, I knew that this was far from over. The temptation, the thrill of the forbidden, had taken root, and no matter how much I tried to resist, I wasn't sure I could ever truly let it go. The next morning, I awoke with a strange heaviness in my chest, the weight of my thoughts from the night before pressing down on me like an invisible burden. I went through my morning routine, almost on autopilot, hoping the familiar rhythm would ground me, distract me from the restless ache Aaron had stirred within me. But no amount of coffee or chores could silence the echoes of his voice, the intensity in his gaze, the way he'd looked at me as though I were the only person in the world. After breakfast, my son and Ben decided to go out for a bit, leaving Aaron behind to gather his things. The knowledge that we were alone, even if only for a few moments, made my heart race, my nerves thrumming with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I told myself it was nothing, that we would just exchange polite goodbyes. But as I moved about the kitchen, I could feel his presence, a quiet but powerful reminder of everything that had gone unsaid between us. I tried to busy myself, scrubbing the countertops with unnecessary vigor, but I was painfully aware of the silence, the tension building in the air as he entered the kitchen. "You're up early," he said, his voice soft, casual, as though nothing had happened. But the way he looked at me, steady, intent, told a different story. I shrugged, hoping to mask the nerves bubbling within me. Just wanted to get an early start. He nodded, watching me with a quiet intensity that made my skin prickle. "Listen, about last night, I didn't mean to make things uncomfortable for you." His words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the line we'd almost crossed, the unspoken desires that had simmered between us. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, grateful for the chance to clear the air, to put an end to the turmoil that had kept me awake all night. "I appreciate that, Aaron," I replied, my voice softer than I'd intended. "I think we both got a little caught up in the moment." He smiled, a faint, rueful expression that seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken words. He paused, searching for the right words. "I haven't met someone who made me feel the way you do." I swallowed hard, feeling the warmth rise in my cheeks, the impact of his words cutting through my defenses. He was younger, yes, but the sincerity in his voice, the quiet longing in his eyes, made it impossible to dismiss his feelings as mere infatuation. "Aaron, I started, struggling to find the right words, to balance honesty with the boundaries I knew I needed to set. This, whatever it is between us, it's dangerous." He nodded, his expression filled with regret. "I know. I wouldn't want to make things complicated for you." For a moment we stood there in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us, filling the space between us with a quiet, painful tension. I wanted to reach out to offer some kind of comfort, but I knew that even the smallest touch would be crossing a line, one that I wasn't sure I could handle crossing. Just as I took a deep breath, ready to say something, anything that might bring closure, I heard the sound of the front door opening. My son's voice echoed through the hallway, calling out a cheerful, "Mom, we're back." The sudden interruption made my heart skip, a jolt of adrenaline shooting through me as I stepped back, putting a careful distance between us. I could feel my son's footsteps approaching, each one a reminder of the consequences, of the reality that lay just outside the safe little bubble that had surrounded us. Aaron, quick to react, moved to the sink, casually turning on the tap as though he'd been helping with the dishes. My son walked into the kitchen moments later, oblivious to the tension that lingered in the air. "Oh, hey, Aaron," he said, giving his friend a warm smile. "Thanks for helping my mom out." "No problem," Aaron replied smoothly, glancing my way with a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Just trying to earn my keep?" The moment passed, and my son continued talking, sharing the details of his morning with the ease of someone blissfully unaware of the quiet storm that had nearly broken loose. I tried to focus on his words, nodding along and responding where appropriate, but my mind kept drifting back to the charged moment I just shared with Aaron, the intensity of his gaze, the weight of his words. Once my son and his friends left the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, feeling the overwhelming rush of relief mixed with regret. The close call had jolted me back to reality, a stark reminder of everything I had to lose, the family I'd worked so hard to build, the trust that lay at the foundation of my marriage. The temptation, the thrill of Aaron's attention, was a beautiful, dangerous thing, one that could unravel everything I held dear. But even as I told myself to let it go, to forget the forbidden connection that had sparked between us, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Aaron had awakened something within me, a desire I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, a reminder of the part of myself I'd buried beneath the weight of routine and responsibility. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to refocus, to remind myself of the life I'd chosen, the boundaries I needed to uphold. But the ache lingered, a quiet, persistent voice that whispered of what might have been, of the passion that lay just beyond the boundaries I'd set for myself. As the day wore on, I went through the motions, determined to hold on to the stability I'd fought so hard to build. But the memory of Aaron's gaze, the intensity in his voice, lingered like a ghost, haunting the quiet moments, filling the empty spaces with a quiet longing I couldn't shake. And as night fell, the silence of the house pressing in around me, I knew that no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the memory of our connection would linger, a quiet reminder of the choices I'd made and the desires I'd left unfulfilled.